The title of my paper is America as a Theological-Political Problem, and I will explain what that means as we proceed. The contemporary political philosopher Pierre Manent begins his celebrated 1987 book, An Intellectual History of Liberalism, with a chapter entitled Europe and the Theological-Political Problem. Therein, one finds a striking passage right near the beginning of the book. He says, quote, "Organizing men's social and political life is not the church's raison d'etre, but by its very existence and distinctive vocation, it posed an immense political problem to the European peoples. This point must be stressed. The political development of Europe is understandable only as the history of answers to problems posed by the Church, which was a human association of a completely new kind. The key to European development is what might be called, in scholarly terms, the theologico-political problem." End quote. According to Manent, the essence of the problem that he claims the Catholic Church posed to Europe, is the following. On the one hand, the Church is not a political entity, the purpose of which, if it were a political entity, would be to organize human existence in the world. But instead, the Church is concerned essentially with the life to come, the eschaton, which lies beyond the horizon of this world. On the other hand, Manent continues, because what we do in this world cannot help but bear on what happens to us in the hereafter, to put it sort of simply, the Church has a tendency to get involved in human affairs and thus constantly to encroach on the political sphere. So in other words, he says, this is Manent's position, while the Church is by definition unconcerned with politics, because the kingdom is not of this world, nevertheless, it inevitably does get involved in politics. And that's a problem. That's for Manent, a contradiction, a problem. Manent goes so far as to call this dilemma, and this is a quote from him, a contradiction embedded in the Church's doctrine. End quote. These words suggest that the problem is not accidental. Instead, the problem is essential to Catholicism. And again, I'm laying out Manent's position here. What we have here, in other words, is not just a worrisome tendency for the Church to overstep the bounds she sets for herself and thus to betray her doctrine, but rather a drive to follow her doctrine and precisely for that reason to run into contradiction with herself. Manent does not say exactly what doctrine he has in mind in making this claim, beyond the somewhat vague description of the Church's aim to be both otherworldly and this worldly. But one suspects at the core is the extraordinary paradox of the Incarnation. Because, you might say, a kind of transgression of theology into the domain of human nature would seem to be necessarily implied in this central Christian mystery. Without ceasing to be God, the second person of the Trinity became man, and he is fully and uncompromisingly the one, while also being fully and uncompromisingly the other. So we'll come back to this point later on, the Incarnation. But for now, I simply want to note that Manent seems to take this doctrine, or at least its implication, to be a problem that threatens the free unfolding of life in this world, even while it claims to liberate that life. So, according to Manent, it's crucial that we recognize that this, what he calls the theological-political problem, is something specifically Christian, or in fact, he's emphatic about this, specifically Catholic. He explains that with Judaism and Islam, We also have religions that lay claim to the way we live in this world, and thus lay claim they get involved in the political sphere. But for Manent, that's not a contradiction in those instances. Why? Because there's nothing in their teaching that would obviously suggest that they shouldn't do that. There's nothing about the liberating of the natural sphere in the teachings of Judaism and Islam. So they're sort of naturally theocratic, you might say. Okay. It's specifically Christianity, according to Manent, that both affirms the integrity of the secular order of nature in itself, which is to say it liberates the temporal order, life in this world, to proceed on its own terms in a certain sense, and denies that integrity and separation by subjecting the secular order constantly to theological judgment, measuring by its eschatological aim. Okay, so this is Manent's position. Manent's larger claim, then, is that if we want to understand the essence of Europe, the heart of European identity, or we might say the essence really of modern Western civilization, we have to understand that identity as constituting itself precisely in and through the attempt to relieve this particular contradiction. Manent concludes his brief opening chapter with a paragraph that contains a succinct statement of his thesis. So here's a quote again from Manent. Quote, "Only by looking at this theological-political problem does the subsequent political development of Europe become intelligible. One can present the problem in an almost mathematical form. Given the characteristics of the Catholic Church, find the political form X that makes it possible to ensure the secular world's independence." End quote. So the rest of his book then is to try to show how the modern liberal nation state is the X that turns out to best protect, you might say, the secular sphere from the intrusion of the church. So in sum, for Manent, the phenomenon of European liberalism is best understood as as a response to the problem set in motion by the Catholic Church. So that's his thesis. I hope that's clear. The aim of my lecture now, this afternoon here, is to flip the script, so to speak, with respect to that thesis. I want to argue that whatever merit there might be in Manent's account as a historical matter, and I think it's actually very insightful to interpret the development of the modern nation state as a kind of response to Catholicism. I think that's actually incredibly illuminating. Nevertheless, in terms of the essence of the matter, I think he has it exactly wrong. So I'm going to argue that it is in fact the liberal regime that poses the theological-political problem, and that ultimately the only solution to the problem is the Catholic Church. I'm going to claim that the American experiment represents something like the perfection of liberalism, at least in this particular respect, in relation to the religious liberty question, not in every respect, of course. In other words, that the American experiment represents a purer instance of the political form X that makes it possible to ensure the secular world's independence, to use Manent's language. The American regime stands out as a kind of ideal arrangement toward which the nation states that define the West was striving over the course of modern history. And in this case, it seems to me we can gain a special kind of insight into the American regime and its origin and its current condition when we reflect on it specifically in relation to the claims of the Catholic Church. So Menent argued that to understand modern Europe, we need to see that its formation of the liberal nation-state was a response to the problem posed by the Catholic Church. I'm going to argue that instead, to understand America, we need to understand it as posing a problem to which the Catholic Church is the answer. What follows can't be, of course, a thorough study of every aspect of this thesis. But I hope by the end to sketch out the basic contours of this proposal so that we can open up a conversation. I expect some pushback on it. And I invite it. I think we could have an interesting conversation, I hope. Okay. Before we look a little more closely at the presuppositions and implications of Menent's assessment, it'll be helpful to make a brief comment on the phrase theologico-political problem that Menent uses and that stands in the title of my own presentation. Menent's phrase has a proximate and an ultimate source. The proximate source is Menent's principal mentor, the great 20th century political philosopher Leo Strauss. Strauss confessed at one point that what he called the theological-political problem was the central concern that occupied his thinking over the course of his career. For this Jewish emigre, the problem was not simply a historical phenomenon, as it appears to be in Menent, but instead an expression of the conflict that's essential to religion. Faith for Strauss presents a comprehensive system of claims that rests on a principle that is different from and, in some sense, inaccessible to reason, which generates its own comprehensive system of claims. And then political regimes for Strauss are always an institutionalized attempt to grapple with the tension here. So this tension between reason and revelation, between faith and reason for Leo Strauss, there's a conflict there. They can't talk to each other. They can't understand each other, and it creates a conflict. To what do you give your allegiance, and how do you resolve this tension? For him, that's what he called the theological-political problem, and he thought that politics is always trying to resolve that tension. So that's Leo Strauss. The ultimate source of the phrase comes from the Jewish Enlightenment thinker from the 17th century, Benedict Spinoza, to whom Strauss devoted one of his earliest studies. Spinoza's book, The Theologico-Political Treatise, which one of the earliest reviewers famously referred to as a book forged in hell. That was the rave review when it first came out, is generally recognized as the classic text articulating the new approach to religious liberty that came to define the modern Western political project. Written, as we know, in the context of intense religious violence by a person of Jewish descent with a deep cultural memory of persecution and displacement, the book proposed a political arrangement that would privilege the good of civil peace and promote tolerance for religious believers who would be bound by the law to respect the differing faith traditions of others. This was Spinoza's revolutionary idea. While it would be illuminating to look into the arguments of Spinoza's book in detail, you'll be relieved to know we're not going to do that. For our immediate purposes, it suffices to observe that Spinoza spends the first part of the book, in fact, most of the book, in a careful investigation and interpretation of Scripture. And in fact, he inaugurates what most people will identify. This is the origin of what we came to call the historical critical method of reading Scripture. His book is sort of a first instance of that. And what he does in the book is essentially refutes the claims that lie at the foundation of the traditional self-understanding of the Jews. And he does so in order to clear the space, so to speak, for religious toleration and freedom of belief. So he tries to show how the ways that Jews have understood themselves as the chosen people and so forth are not true. He gives sort of scientific explanation of miracles. He wants to downplay. So it's sort of a radical refutation of Judaism and by implication Christianity. It's interesting. He doesn't attack Christianity directly. He attacks Judaism, but of course if Judaism goes, then at least Catholic, well, Christianity can't stand. So I'll come back to Spinoza later on. It's a matter of some controversy whether and to what extent Spinoza had an influence on America's founding fathers. Unlike figures such as John Locke, Montesquieu, and others, Spinoza is almost never cited explicitly by the theorists who eventually authored the American regime. In spite of this fact, not so long ago, the popular intellectual historian Matthew Stewart argued that the specifically Spinozist conception of God, Spinoza referred to nature's God, God or nature, considered an abstraction from any specific religious tradition and accessible to natural reason alone without revelation, runs virtuously unanimously among the major thinkers in early America. So, Matthew Stewart claims Spinoza is omnipresent between the lines of their writing, even if he rarely comes to expression in the lines themselves. It's sort of a background figure, according to Matthew Stewart. Now, of course, claims about unmentioned influences are always hard to prove, and I think, in fact, it can never be proven conclusively, even if you have a mountain of circumstantial evidence. But fortunately, no final decision regarding Stewart's bold thesis is necessary for the argument that I want to make here. The fact of the matter is that the ideal of religious liberty, more or less along the lines Spinoza laid out, was not an afterthought in the founding of America, as something that ought to be accommodated given the introduction post hoc of religiously diverse citizens into the already established regime, but was present from the beginning, or even in a certain sense before the beginning. So much so that we could say that religious liberty of this liberal sort, and I'll explain that qualification in a moment, was the very point of America. Though the myth would require various qualifiers, there's a basic truth to the story that every one of us heard growing up, which is that America came to be when the Puritans set off to the newly discovered land in search of a place wherein they could practice their faith without fear of persecution. We all know the story. America is perhaps unique in all the world in being a nation in which the new modern form of religious liberty was not something for which a space had to be carved out from an actually given regime, one that gave expression at some level to a prior religious tradition, but was already there from the start, equiprimordial, you might say, with the regime itself. And I think this is one of the reasons I want to suggest that America represents something of a perfection of what the nation states in Europe were striving for. In a certain sense, the founding of America had unique circumstances that allowed it to be instantiated in a much more, in a purer sense, purer way. The fact that the American founders were given a blank canvas of sorts on which to paint their ideal regime, blank, I think we all need to recognize, of course, from their perspective, not from the perspective of those who had been living in the New World for centuries. This fact explains one of the most evident differences between Spinoza's treatise and the American project. As I mentioned a moment ago, Spinoza had to dismantle the tradition he inherited as a first step on the way to clearing the ground for the religiously tolerant regime he sought to propose. If a tradition, which as such is naturally inclined to take its own truth for granted as an unqualified starting point for everything else, if that, a tradition in this robust sense, is permitted to set the context for consideration of other religious claims, then it would seem religious tolerance in the liberal sense, which demands equal treatment and equal recognition before the law, is not possible. The given tradition will inevitably have privileges that will therefore be not denied to other faiths, the ones that don't belong to that given tradition. In this case, the claims of the given tradition have to be neutralized, so to speak, in order to open equal space for other traditions. So Spinoza was able to neutralize the claims of the Jewish tradition, or we may say the biblical tradition, only by showing that they're not true. In other words, positively demonstrating to his mind that they're false, at least as the claims are understood from within the tradition itself. The Jews, he explained, are not the chosen people, as they have always understood themselves to be up to this point. Instead, one ought to read the scriptures, according to Spinoza, more allegorically, to be saying that all people are in principle chosen people. This new interpretation, or this way of interpreting that he proposes, establishes a kind of theoretical platform that allows one to stand outside one's given tradition and thereby to occupy a position in principle. The idea is that in principle, from that position one can give equal regard, at least in the law, which is concerned about civil peace above all else, to any and every other tradition, or for that matter, even to the rejection of religious tradition. So that's Spinoza. The architects of America differ from Spinoza in that they do not refute the truth of their faith. In this case, Christianity, and as we know, almost entirely in its Protestant expression, in order to clear space for religious liberty. Quite to the contrary, very differently from Spinoza in this regard, who, for his part, sought to develop a perfectly rational philosophical religion without any obligation to a special revelation that would privilege one group over another. That was Spinoza's project. The founding fathers, or at least many of them, maybe most, were passionately devoted to the truth of Christianity, and came to America, in fact, precisely so as to be able to affirm that truth and to practice it freely. But the question remains whether the religious liberty they eventually, if not initially, were to affirm, what Jefferson famously called the wall of separation between church and state, does not, in fact, assume effectively the same position proposed by Spinoza. So that's a claim I'm going to be making, that effectively, for all intents and purposes, it's a version of Spinoza's project. Clearing the ground by denying the truth of any precedent tradition. In other words, the question is whether the American founders did not actively reject the truth of the Christian tradition, for example, in contrast to the revolutionaries in France, because they embraced a different conception of religious liberty, which is founded on the truth of the Christian tradition, or instead, is it because they took the neutralization of religious tradition as already accomplished in principle? So I contend that in some sense we can affirm both explanations, but ultimately I think the latter is the better one, and I will explain that here. So we can grasp the way to reconcile the seemingly contradictory explanation. So in other words, do they not reject Christianity because they're assuming it's true and it's informing what we mean by religious liberty? Or are they assuming that its claims have been neutralized like Spinoza wanted, and therefore we have religious liberty? And I want to say, in a certain sense, it's both. But the latter one is the more adequate, comprehensive explanation. And I'll explain why here. So we can grasp the way to reconcile these if we consider the significance of tradition in faith. So this is going to be the key, tradition. What role does tradition have in faith? It's not an accident that the Founding Fathers mostly embraced a specifically Protestant Christianity, which is, we might say, a Christianity that has essentially freed itself from tradition. Or in other words, a Christianity that has marginalized the mediation of things like tradition, hierarchy, established liturgical rites, and inherited cultural forms, and privileged instead the faith of the individual precisely as an individual. The predominant religion in early America was not Judaism, not Catholicism, certainly not Islam, to stay only with the religions present in some significant way in the West. Anglicanism represents actually, I think, a pretty interesting counterexample that somebody might want to propose, because we think of Anglicanism as having much more of a kind of positive sense of tradition and hierarchy and so forth. But I would argue that, and I think it's uncontroversial to say that Anglicanism in its traditional form, which recognizes the king as the head of the church, was not the form that eventually prevailed in America. But we can discuss that. In any event, that did not dominate the religious ethos of America as America settled into the characteristic position on the relation between church and state. The reason the notion of tradition is so decisive here, I think, is that tradition implies a truth about God, an interpretation of the nature of God and of man's proper relation to him, an understanding of who God is and a way of living out that understanding, which precedes the individual and makes a claim on the individual prior to his own determination of the claim. In other words, tradition embodies the objective realization of truth, which is not most fundamentally, therefore, left to the individual's discretion or subject to his choice. Spinoza was working his way out of Judaism, which is, of course, as we know, a profoundly traditional religion, and by implication out of the Christianity that then dominated Europe, to the extent that Christianity has its roots in the actual covenant between God and Israel, and so is also profoundly traditional. If you think about it, a covenant means a bond that's already given, it's already established, into which individuals then are born or baptized, but it's already there. Because tradition presents itself not as an option to free choice, but as a precedent claim on freedom, you belong to it before you're free to make a choice, Spinoza had to work through a positive argument against the truth of biblical religion as it understood itself. Notice, he did not dismiss the Bible. And indeed, he came eventually in his book to insist on its importance for instilling in the uneducated a kind of spirit of docility. He said, we still need the Bible to make people willing to obey the political order. But to the elite, the intellectuals, he showed why the Bible is not true. It's a good instrument, but it's not true. He didn't eliminate the Bible. Instead, he reinterpreted it. And he reinterpreted it in a specifically non-traditional way. The American founders, by contrast, did not have to critique religion. Whether they were enthusiastic Christians, as we most often believe, or secret Spinozists, as Stewart believes, it doesn't matter really in relation to this argument. Why? Because the claims of religion, precisely as established tradition, were in either case already neutralized. This already cleared horizon left them free to insist on the truth of the Christian God, or indeed any God one might wish, one might choose, as sincerely and even as publicly as possible, but always in the form of a truth that individuals are free to accept for themselves alone, precisely not as an inherited reality that binds us all together, both individually and collectively, which means also in some sense binds our government. The precise way in which government can owe deference to a religious tradition is, of course, a huge question. And I'm going to bracket it here. But if anyone wants to raise this question in the question and answer period, I'd be happy to engage it. What I want to argue instead at this point is that the conception of religious liberty embraced in the American regime, interpreted as a paradigmatic expression of liberalism, poses its own theological-political problem, though we'll see it's an inversion of the problem that Manent described. Nevertheless, I want to suggest it's more radical and it's a more intractable expression of the problem. So to remind you, as we recall, Manent presented the problem as arising from the fact that while being essentially theological, eschatologically oriented, the church cannot help but intrude into the political, the affairs of this world. It's important to see that Manent's interpretation is itself not an interpretation of the church on the church's terms, but rather on the terms already of liberalism. The theologian John Milbank has brilliantly demonstrated this point in an essay. I highly recommend it. It's not an easy read, but I keep going back to it myself. An essay called The Gift of Ruling by John Milbank. It's a brilliant essay. The implication of this point is that it is liberalism and not Christianity that gives rise to the theological-political problem. And I'll explain how that is more precisely in just a moment. In any event, my suggestion is that the liberal regime, which claims to limit the political sphere to matters concerning this world alone, and thus in a way that would leave the theological sphere perfectly free to be determined by the unpressured choice of free individuals, nevertheless cannot help but make a substantial judgment about the nature of religion. It cannot help but decide in a definitive and binding way what kind of religion is permitted and what kind is not. And indeed, it will inevitably make a judgment about the nature of God and his relation to the world. So the liberal regime claims to be tolerant of all religious faith. But in fact, by its own inner logic, it imposes universally a distinctive form of belief. This is a deeper and more weighty version of the theological-political problem than the one Manent described, in part because in this case it hides itself. It denies it does what it inevitably does and denies this as it is doing it. Or even more directly, the very denial is itself the transgression. Now that, what in the world am I saying? Let's look into this matter more carefully. Jeremy mentioned my father in the introduction. One of the central concerns of my father's intellectual work for his whole life was to unmask what he called the false neutrality of liberalism. He sought to show that precisely by not committing, as it were, to a substantial view of the nature and reality of God as something already given, and so taken for granted in some fundamental respect, liberalism de facto, and perhaps in spite of anyone's intentions, explicit intentions, nevertheless establishes a conception of God that coheres with its distinctive interpretation of freedom. It tailors God to fit what it takes freedom to be. And that means it's giving an interpretation of God. The only God that's allowed is one that will fit in this sense of freedom that we have. And if you embrace a different sort of religion, you're going to be marginalized. That's the argument that's being made here. So we might say that by carving out a free space for the exercise of religion by individuals, it permits only that God which fits into the space already carved out. And it marginalizes any other sense of God, if not excluding it altogether. So it says one can believe in any God one chooses, any God one wishes to believe in, as long as it is not a God of any properly religious tradition. A God who, so to speak, chooses us in that tradition before we choose him, who precisely as creator is already given in the order of reality prior to any individual's free determination. So here's the claims. In the end, it turns out what we have here is actually, inevitably, an established religion, which privileges the conception of faith as essentially private, and the conception of the praxis of faith as the activity performed by associations of free individuals, self-choosing individuals, which is incidentally not how the Catholic Church understands itself, or any other traditional religious body would not recognize that description. So they're excluded. It includes some and excludes others. It's an established religion. It's not an equal playing field, you see. The privileging of a religion that most basically conforms to individual choice and to private conscience, taken as supreme standards for matters theological, necessarily marginalizes and puts at a disadvantage all other understandings of religion. Arguably, in another context, I'd want to make this bigger argument, it eliminates religion in principle, insofar as religion in the classical sense is essentially a social or communal act and does not revolve around the individual. But that's a point for another day. We could say that the liberal state establishes a specifically Protestant notion of God, since it does not fit the Jewish or Catholic or Orthodox, I would include them here, view. Islam is interesting. It's a little more ambiguous because in a certain sense, Islam has more in common with Protestantism than with these traditional forms of religion, because it's much more unmediated, a sense of God. And in that sense, in a curious sort of way, it's more easily reconcilable with kind of individualism. But okay, so I said in a certain sense it fits the Protestant conception of God, but I want to qualify that. It doesn't even fit the Protestant conception of God. Even this does not yet get us to the heart of the matter. The pseudo-neutrality of the liberal state, or to put the point more plainly now, the positive religious establishment that constitutes the liberal state, does indeed privilege the form that suits Protestantism, this kind of the religion of the heart, individual before God, which is a distinctively modern reconception of religion. But precisely in its claim to be neutral, the liberal state denies the content of even the Protestant God, insofar as that content is taken in any way as something given in an a priori sense. So this is why I'm suggesting that the liberal nation state represents such a profound radicalizing of the theological-political problem. Menent had characterized the problem as arising from the fact that the church is supposed to be merely theological, set outside of worldly life, but it nevertheless persists in intruding on the political. We still have to consider whether that's a proper understanding of Catholicism, which I'll do in just a second. But the liberal state pretends to free the theological, so the opposite, free the theological by restricting itself to the political alone. And yet, it not only intrudes on the theological, it eliminates it in anything but a fully modern form, which is to say, as a matter of pure individual preference. And it does so without admitting that it's doing that, denying that it's establishing a religion, and so in this sense, not allowing any possible criticism. It simply dismisses all criticism. If this problem here did not immediately present an obvious challenge to Protestant Christianity in the beginning, it seems to me over the course of time, it's evidently, I think we can all attest to this, it's weakened the tradition elements of that Christianity, and it's eroded any dogmatic substance of that Christianity. By its own logic, the liberal state will tend to privilege precisely that form of Protestantism with the least dogmatic commitments, and ultimately will flush them all away. Thomas Jefferson, you may know, famously observed in a letter that in the long run, Americans were all going to end up Unitarian. That was his prediction. So that's Christianity without dogmatic content at all. History, of course, is always more complex than such predictions allow, but we can assume that there will be, in the religious consciousness of Americans, a general drift toward what the sociologist Christian Smith and his colleagues dubbed therapeutic moralistic deism. Have you heard that expression? These sociologists did a survey of young Americans and asked them to describe the religion that they believe in and the nature of God. And in the end, said that there was actually, for all of the diversity that we believe that we have, the answers to the questions were amazingly similar. And they characterized this, if you were to give a name to the religion that was expressed by the great majority of people, it would be this therapeutic moralistic deism, a belief in a God or a higher power that basically wants us to be good and wants us to feel better about ourselves and that kind of thing. So it doesn't really matter in a way whether if that's your religion, whether you associate it with the Christian God of Jesus Christ or you associate it with the spaghetti monster in outer space, whatever that is, or whatever it is. In a way, that becomes kind of an arbitrary addition, but the core of it is this simply this kind of very immanentist sort of religion. I'll leave it to the judgment of the audience whether that phrase, therapeutic moralistic deism, captures the spirit of our public religious consciousness or not. In any event, it bears remarking that deism is the religious inheritance of Spinoza's philosophy. For the last part of my presentation, I will a bit more briefly explain two other dimensions of my overarching thesis. This will go fairly quickly. Namely, in the first place, that the formulation of a theological-political problem, which is to say the formulation of the relationship between religion and political society as essentially conflictual, and so as inevitably posing a problem in need of some practical solution, is so endemic to liberalism as to be constitutive of it. And second, that Catholic Christianity, and I would include also Orthodox Christianity, big O, presents what seemed to me to be the only solution to that problem, or to put the point more adequately, the only conception of the relation between the theological and political orders that, at least in principle, prevents the problem from arising in the first place. Okay, the first point. First point can be made rather simply. The theological-political problem as a problem presupposes a fundamental opposition between the two orders, such that each is most perfectly itself in clear separation from the other. In other words, the ideal envisioned in the formulation of the problem is two self-enclosed spheres of operation, which coexist peacefully because they have essentially nothing to do with one another. Live and let live, as the saying goes. It's this ideal that causes the relation between the theological and political spheres to appear as a problem. But this is a specifically liberal ideal, or more properly put, I would say a liberal delusion, the invention of an abstraction that could never exist in reality even if you wanted it to. In other words, the relation between the theological and the political is a conflict in principle, or even to use Manent's language, a contradiction, only in light of this ideal, which is an invention of liberalism. I would like to suggest that the contradiction is not generated by the Catholic Church, as Menend suggested, but generated by liberalism, and then projected back into or onto the Catholic Church, precisely in order to justify the modern liberal nation state as a solution to the problem. It would, of course, require a more in-depth argument to develop the thesis than there's space for here, but it seems to me that what we have here is analogous to the founding of other modern institutions. If you study this, you'll see this pattern shows up everywhere in the kind of origins of modernity. So capitalism, for example, projects into nature and history an essential condition of scarcity and competition, to which it turns out capitalism is the solution. The social contract theory of political order projects into a mythical past a state of nature which is the war of all against all, to which the social contract is the solution. The political contrivance of religious liberty at the core of the liberal state is likewise the solution to the theological-political problem. Now, one might say, well, what about all the religious violence that was a reality in the 17th century Europe and doesn't seem to have been invented by liberalism? And I hope somebody will ask that question in the question period. I'm not going to address it here because of time constraints, but I'd be happy to think about it with you. In what sense then, okay, here's the second part. In what sense then is the Catholic Church maybe not so much the solution, but the alternative to the theological-political problem? There's only time here to state the principle, and I'm coming to my end here. The kernel of truth in Menend's characterization is that Christianity promises, we might say, to liberate the natural order as such in its created integrity, in relative autonomy with respect to the order of redemption with its eschatological realization. I think that's true that when Menend says that. The problem in Menend's interpretation is that he assumes that this meant and this means a separation of the political, and so the natural and the human, from the theological. To be set free means to be set apart from. But the principle of the liberation of nature in Christianity is the incarnation, which makes the relation between the natural and the theological far more paradoxical. The incarnation reveals that the liberation of the natural order is a result, an implication of the properly theological reality of God. The integrity of nature, in other words, is best secured within the theological reality, because the theological reality, the real God of salvation history, has affirmed the intrinsic goodness of the natural world, given it, so to speak, an absolute religious sanction as creator and even more intensively as redeemer. In this respect, and again, I think Menend is correct about this, Christianity introduces a kind of complexity that's not found in Judaism and not found in Islam, which are more directly theocratic in principle. It is indeed the case that the full political implications of the incarnation in the light of the drama of history as it's unfolded in time, I think have yet to be seen. But one can make the argument, and this would be my position, that the Catholic affirmation of the relative autonomy of nature allows, in principle, a political order. So here's the thesis. That's a lot kind of rides on this point. Let me repeat. The Catholic affirmation of the relative autonomy of nature, so relative to God, allows, in principle, a political order that would do more justice to what we call religious pluralism than this liberal solution can possibly do. A solution, I think we could say, has been tried, the liberal solution, and failed. Now let me emphasize the paradox here, because I think this paradox typically gets foreshortened or even just overlooked entirely. Namely, the autonomy at issue in this case is precisely a relative one, which means it's a result of the actual relation to the Trinitarian God revealed in Jesus Christ. whose body and bride, the church, has extended the incarnation throughout space and time in the Holy Spirit, destined to encompass the entire cosmos. To the popular imagination, thoroughly formed in ways we're only beginning to realize, I think, by the restricted horizon of intelligibility that the liberal order has imposed on us without our choice, I might add, it would seem contradictory to suggest that the recognition of the authority of Christianity, so of Christianity as an authoritative tradition, is what would allow religious liberty. That would seem just nonsense. Okay. But conceding again that what this means will take time to unfold, and I think would lead actually a full realization, would lead to novel political forms that history has not yet witnessed. I would point out two things. First, that the other alternatives in the West of properly traditional religious forms, Judaism and Islam, do not have the incarnation of God as their fundamental principle. And so would ultimately lack the resources to ground a genuinely analogous freedom to the natural sphere, as distinct from the strictly theological sphere. It's also, and I don't mean to simply equate Judaism and Islam. I think they would address this question in different terms. Judaism in its covenantal form is pointing to something more like an incarnation. There's no covenant in Islam. Second, it seems to me that the proposal sounds quite different once we recognize that no genuinely neutral alternative is possible. So if we were to compare the Catholic interpretation of religious liberty and a liberal interpretation of religious liberty, it seems to me that that's obvious. There's no contest if we really think about the matter. Why? Because liberalism does not allow religious liberty at all. It allows freedom only to the kind of belief that is not actually religious in the proper sense. It allows free exercise to all faith traditions, but only insofar as they cease to be faith traditions in the substantial sense, and instead reconceive themselves from the ground up as various expressions of liberalism. In this sense, Catholicism is in a better position to affirm religious liberty of some sort in principle, since it allows us in actual fact to recognize what a religion is, and would allow us properly to valorize, it seems to me, even if it hasn't done this in the past. I think in principle, it allows us properly to valorize the significance of tradition, of doctrine, of liturgy, of cultural form in Judaism and in Islam, and even in Protestantism, to help sort of set into relief those dimensions of Protestantism that aren't always grasped in those terms, at least in a properly theoretical way, within those traditions themselves. So what this would mean specifically for the American regime, which was founded on the liberal principle of religious freedom more directly and self-consciously than any other political order in history, is an exceedingly difficult one, and will no doubt take many years of prayerful reflection to discern properly, let alone to realize. But it is arguably one of the greatest tasks that falls to us as American Catholics, a task we need to carry out not only for ourselves, but for our fellow citizens. Let us have the courage, therefore, and indeed, I think the genuine hope, to engage it in patience and to withstand the constant temptation to react and give unnuanced answers to the admittedly increasingly provocative challenges that face us today. Thank you.
Time for questions, and he wants some, so.
Yes. In the back, maybe? Yes. So yes, I was told to point, and they'll bring a microphone to you, so.
Thanks for your talk. So I have a question for you. So given the natural tension between, say, the theological order and the worldly order, what would you make of the claim of someone like Charles Taylor, who says that secular liberalism has given us a critical realization of the gospel message through something like religious tolerance? Because he would say in the past that intertwinings of church and state have failed a lot in such things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that would be the basic objection to what I'm arguing. A few things. That's actually, in a way, John Locke's argument in the Letter for Toleration. He sort of appeals to. He says it's precisely Christian to give a sense of to give space and respect to other people, regardless of their faith and so forth. I would say that in a certain sense, I agree entirely with that point. What I would want to emphasize is sometimes that point is made in kind of a strategic way, that you make that point in order to then relativize Christianity with respect to other faiths. But if in fact it is the case that it is Christianity that allows us to do that, then it means that our political order needs to be more fully grounded in the Christian tradition in order to preserve that liberty. And if that's what he means, then it seems to me that's basically the argument that I'm making. If he means by that, then once you've sort of checked that box, then you can relativize and you end up with religious liberty as this generic acceptance of anything. I think you run into the problems that I've been describing. Now, the other part of that is, what about, we've seen the problem that occurs when there's not enough of a separation between the theological and the political. And there are a number of things to say in response to that. First of all, one has to be very careful in one's reading of history on that point. It's not evident that let me put it, first of all, in a more sort of provocative way. Part of the myth of liberalism is to convince us that the worst violence that's ever been perpetrated has been religious violence, and so and that's then why liberalism is the solution. But it seems to me that that's a questionable reading of history, and those that have studied the matter have demonstrated, I think, really conclusively, that it's not an adequate grasp. Religious violence is something that's not, you wouldn't say it's inherent to Christianity, it seems to me. It was a function of the fragmentation of Christianity, at least in one respect, rather than the fulfillment of it. Do you see the full expression of it? So even conceding that point, I would want to suggest that positively in relation to Taylor's thesis, I don't think that the medieval forms were I'm not suggesting that the medieval forms were the best and everything's been a fall from that. I do think that we have learned something of the integrity of the natural world and the temporal order that was not as evident in the Middle Ages, that would allow us to conceive of political forms differently. But what I would add is, it seems to me that we, to really make that point, we need to deepen our theological understanding, deepen our reception of the tradition rather than marginalize it, if that makes sense. So we need a better Christianity. I guess, there's the quick answer. I should have just started with that. There are, a few hands in the back, maybe. Sorry. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk, actually. So one question, actually, because you were talking about on the subject of liberalism. So I was reading this book recently by Patrick Deneen called Why Liberalism Failed. And in it, he sort of talks about, like, he mentions that liberalism is a man-made ideology, and it's not like the natural sort of state of man. And he says, like any sort of man-made ideology, there's going to be lots of contradictions and sort of inconsistencies in it. And his thesis is that basically liberalism has succeeded, and the point that it's sort of come to its end state, and that all of its sort of contradictions are going to cause it to fall in itself. And just going back to your question on the theological political question, you were talking about the problem. You were talking about, do you think sort of with that the inconsistencies of liberalism as this ideology, as this sort of this thought, will lead it to basically, like, is it sort of destined to fall, or unless something is done, will it sort of continue on?
Yes, I mean, I think Patrick Deneen's thesis in that book is essentially true, that liberalism has failed precisely because it has succeeded. And his argument is that it has a kind of a self-undermining logic that's built into it. It has always been kind of parasitic on a substantial tradition that has allowed it to make sense. But to the extent that it then overtakes that tradition, it no longer has the context in which it makes sense, and it begins to dissolve. And I would say, I mean, you asked if I think this might happen. I think it has. I mean, I think it's become apparent. I mean, hasn't it? That things are starting to unravel. I mean, we all have that experience. And it's increasingly difficult to make. We've come to think. I mean, this to me is interesting. On the basis of this original idea of not establishing a religion, we've come now to the point where we don't think you're allowed to say anything in public that is true. Now that's amazing that we would go from one to, but I mean it has. So how often in like legal cases in the Supreme Court, they never defend a position because it's true. They don't say it's important that we protect marriage because marriage is true. That language doesn't. You can only talk about practical implications and you know, it's always a sort of a pragmatic thing. We've somehow no truth claims are recognized as authoritative anymore. And I think that that's something that is profoundly destructive of our humanity. We are rational animals, which means that there is nothing in the world more important to us than truth. Nothing, really. You might say, well, what about love? That's a form of truth. And so the fact that we have sort of become accustomed to spontaneously, I want to say this has entered into our imaginations. We've become accustomed to bracketing any kind of truth claims in public, which means that even when we say them in private, we can't really mean them in the way that they used to mean them, when people just took for granted that to say something true had a certain public authority. I think that is already the state that we're in, and I think that that's one of the implications of this undermining of the theological that's sort of built into the liberal state, if that makes sense.
Hey, thanks, David. Jen and I have been having a great time discussing politics of the real the past few months. Good spousal debates have arisen out of this. Keeping the marriage interesting. But
my wife and I do too. So it's
I really appreciated toward the end of the book, especially the takedown of integralism and the dualism and deontology built into that, right? I think a lot of people probably have my question, and maybe you can't give too much of an answer because you said it's going to take decades to work this out.
Yeah.
But I do think to be a political philosophy, it'd be helpful to have some concrete ideas. You've surely thought of some we could, kind of implement already is one thought I had. Just what are some concrete things we could actually do? Because I found this as a much more valuable alternative to a dualism or an imposition of some kind of integralist monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just if you think you could expound upon that.
Yeah, there are dozens of versions of integralism, and they don't use the word anymore. A lot of them, which is interesting in itself, but that's a whole other. But kind of at least a simple version is this idea that we need to put the church has to have certain positions of power in a way to resolve the problems that are political problems. That's a bit of a caricature. It's much more sophisticated, especially in some thinkers. But the point for me in relation to your specific question is that it's that sort of solution. What we need to do is to reinstate a kind of political authority of the church, and that then is going to solve the problems. It's too simplistic, and it thinks of the relationship between the theological and political still in two extrinsicist terms. You've sort of got politics falling apart, and now from the outside the church is supposed to step in and kind of resolve things. What I think we most need to do is reconceive what politics is in a much more organic way related to the faith. And that means that we don't have to wait until a Catholic is president. We've learned that doesn't work. In a certain sense, what we need to do is change our consciousness, which means think about our relationship to between body and soul differently, our family differently, our household differently, our friendships differently, in a way that there are thousands of things that one can do, practically speaking, in anticipation of a kind of a global political solution. Teach our children what it means to belong to a tradition. Give a kind of priority to a sort of civic, communal spirit in our neighborhoods. Recognize that the parish, the church, is not just a place where we pray, but is a center of life. So that increasingly it's a place where people should gather, have social gatherings, and have lectures, and have there are millions of kind of organic, simple, concrete things that one can do. That's already. The point is, the most basic point, I guess, is that we don't need to wait for politics to solve the problem. We have to think about what does it mean to say that the Catholic Church is true? And I guarantee we think that that's easy. Of course, we're believers. We have so thoroughly imbibed a kind of liberal sense of religious freedom that we can't help but translate that it's true into it's true for me, or it's true for my family, in a way that undermines the point. So we need to first work on ourselves in that regard.
I think this is going to have to be the final question.
Okay. A lot of pressure.
Yeah, wow. The two-party system seems to be anything but neutral, right? It's like pick a side. So how do we, as Americans, live in that state of paradoxical, mysterious in-betweenness without falling victim to what the two-party system has built by nature?
Yeah. That's interesting, the two-party system. To think about, that seems like a fairly innocuous arrangement, but it's really interesting if you were to study it closer. There's some interesting political philosophers that have reflected on this. Pierre Menendez is one. I should mention, I'm very critical of him in this paper, but in general, I love his work. I don't mean to make a global criticism, but there's something about the two-party system that sort of mechanizes political life in a way that removes it from a deeper human context. And so what do? I mean, this is the situation that we're in. We need to, it seems to me, at the very least, there's no solution to that problem. It's not like I can tell you you should vote this way or that way, or you shouldn't vote, or you should whatever. There's no simple solution. But the response to the problem is a recovery of a sense of prudence, but a deep sense of prudence, not a superficial sense of prudence, and a deep sense of, often when people appeal to prudence, they want to sort of reduce things to just pragmatic solutions. But the prudence is impossible without a recognition of what's true. You first come to a deep understanding, and it's only going to be genuine prudence to the extent that you have an adequate conception of what's true. And in the light of that, you then try to do the best you can to realize that truth in your particular circumstances. That's what prudence is. We tend not to think of it that way. But that's excruciating when the circumstances allow very little of it. But that's what it means to be Catholic in the modern world. I mean, that's our task. And as my dad always would say, Christ, he took the form of sin. He didn't think about what that meant. An undergoing of he didn't try to fix things from the outside. And he didn't sort of just install a good leader or something. He didn't have kind of an instantaneous solution. He entered into it and suffered the tensions and contradictions that of disorder that are there, but always in light of, in relation to, in the affirmation of ultimate truth. And each of us is called to do something like that in the modest ways that are available to us. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Schindler. Go and sin no more.